Perhaps the most common understanding of ethics is that of a list of rules, commandments, obligations, duties, etc. For example, consider the moral rule, do not kill. If you should ask why, the likely answer is because it is wrong. This is the core idea of the ethical theory called deontology. Some things are simply wrong. You shouldn't lie because it is wrong, not because honesty is the best policy and that honesty results in the best consequences. Indeed, even though some would claim that deontology is an older ethical theory than utilitarianism, it is helpful to see deontology as a reaction against utilitarianism. The following table summarizes some of the contrasts between utilitarianism and deontology. For the utilitarian, the consequences of an action are what matters as far as ethics is concerned. If the consequences are on the whole good, then the action is ethically justified, otherwise not. For the deontologist, some things can be right or wrong regardless of the consequences. For example, killing an innocent person is wrong, regardless of the consequences. Recall the transplant case from the last lecture. By killing a healthy person and harvesting his organs, the surgeon is able to save the lives of 4 people. The utilitarian struggles either to defend this action or to explain why, according to utilitarian principles, this action is nevertheless ethically unacceptable, even though more lives are saved. In contrast, the deontologist has no problem explaining the unacceptability of the transplant case. Killing an innocent person is wrong, regardless of the consequences, even if more lives are saved. The deontologist rejects the idea that the ends ever justify the means. The utilitarian's exclusive focus on consequences points to another contrast with deontology. For the utilitarian, the motives or intentions of an action are morally irrelevant. They do not matter. If the results are bad, it doesn't matter, according to the utilitarian, whether the intentions were good or not. For the deontologist, the motives or intentions are of primary moral concern. For example, suppose A steals B's car. Suppose further that if the car had not been stolen, B would have driven it and wound up in a fatal car accident that very day. Even though A's action saved B's life, that was not A's intention. His intention was to steal the car. The fact that his action saved B's life was an unintended consequence of his action. It cannot, according to the deontologist, excuse, much less justify, his theft. A different way of putting this point is to note that, for the utilitarian, whether an action is ethical depends upon what happens in the world. But since no one has control over all the consequences of his actions, that means that the ethical assessment of an action, according to the utilitarian, will depend upon things that the person has no control over. The deontologist rejects this. Ethics should be only about what people have control over. People should not be held morally responsible, praised, or blamed for things they have no control over. People do have control over their motives and intentions, or, to use a more general term, they have control over their will. Ethics, according to the deontologist, is about the will. The contrast between the utilitarian and the deontologist points to another difference. As long as good consequences are forthcoming, it does not matter, according to the utilitarian, who brings these good consequences about. The moral assessment is solely about the outcomes. It does not matter whether the person intended to bring about those good consequences. For the deontologist, however, it does matter. Did the person intend to bring about those consequences? Finally, we should note the contrasting views regarding whether there is a moral difference between actions and omissions, between, for example, doing harm and allowing harm. This contrast is well illustrated in some discussions of euthanasia. Consider the following two situations. In one, a terminally ill patient who is in extreme pain requests that you, the physician, cease any further treatment, knowing full well that with treatment withdrawn, death will soon follow. You withdraw treatment, and the patient indeed dies. In the second case, the terminally ill patient in extreme pain asks you, the physician, to end his life by injecting him with an overdose of morphine. In the first case, you have let the person die. In the second case, you have caused the person to die. For the utilitarian, there is no moral difference. The end result of your actions is the same. The person has died. For the deontologist, there is a moral difference. Death is intended in the second case, but not in the first. We will talk about these contrasts more later. For now, our task is to formulate the deontology position. Whereas the concept of good and bad is central to utilitarianism, the concept of right and wrong is central to deontology. Now, the concept of right and wrong can be partly captured by the idea of a moral right. A right. For example, people have a right to life. Therefore, it is morally wrong to kill someone because that violates his right to life. Contrast this with the utilitarian, who would say that killing is bad because the result is loss of life and life is good. It would seem that we can articulate much of the deontologist's position by a list of moral rights, and it's not difficult to at least begin making such a list. We talk about the right to life. In addition, we can talk about a right to self-determination or a right to liberty, a right to property, right to privacy, right to self-defense, a right to vote, a right to health care, and so forth. Of course, calling something a right does not make it so. I might truly want to own a fancy sports car, but it is ridiculous to say I have a moral right to own a sports car. When we ask how moral rights are realized in public policy, the answer obviously is by making the moral right a matter of law, in which case a legal right is created. For example, there is not only a moral right to life, there is also a legal right to life, which means that the right is protected by the laws of the country. But not all moral rights are legal rights, and not all legal rights are moral rights. For example, consider patent law. Patent law gives the owner of a patent a legal right to prohibit others from using her patented invention for 20 years. It's implausible to say that there's also a moral right to protect patents for 20 years. No, there's just a legal right. On the other hand, many would argue that we have a moral right of privacy. While that right might be realized into a legal right of privacy in some cases, in other cases, such as in airport terminals, the legal right of privacy falls far short of the moral right. So, what makes something a moral right? The most influential theories that attempts to answer that question is the one developed by Immanuel Kant, considered by many to be the greatest philosopher of all time. His philosophical theories are complex and subtle and defy an easy summary. They rest on such ideas as the value of autonomy and the requirement that people should be treated as ends and never merely as means. And they have had a profound influence on thinking about ethics ever since his time. I will not discuss these ideas in this lecture, but I will try to do so in the next. My aim in this lecture is to describe the logic and properties of moral rights. But before turning to that, let me summarize some of what we have said so far regarding deontology. To summarize, Ethics, according to the deontologists, consists of a list of commandments or rules or obligations, not a calculation, as you would have with the utilitarian. Another feature, we said, some actions are simply wrong, according to the deontologists, regardless of consequences. And the common formulation of deontology is captured, much of it captured by the idea of moral rights. In the next section, I will try to examine some of the important features of moral rights.